Is Viktor Orban really a dictator? Or did he just become one today after Hungary's parliament passed a new emergency law? Well, if you're reading the mainstream media, that's exactly the impression you'd get. We can start with what Bloomberg had to report today by Zoltan Simon. Orban takes sole command of Hungary with emergency law. It says here that Hungary's parliament handed Prime Minister Viktor Orban the right to rule by decree indefinitely, effectively putting the European democracy under his sole command for as long as he sees fit. Human Rights Watch, writing about the same piece of legislation, said Hungary's Orban uses pandemic to seize unlimited power, and that the emergency draft law was a clear threat to democratic freedoms. It says here also, just kind of following up, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has seized the COVID-19 pandemic to undermine the fundamental principles of democracy and rule of law in a way that is hard to reconcile as necessary for public health. And that's not all. If you read Twitter, you're going to get a nonstop slew of people who are just raising the alarm about this. Ben Judah, former Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. Here you have a tweet from Balázs Checo? I don't know. Hungarian parliament passes bill that gives PM Orban unlimited power and proclaims a state of emergency without a time limit, rule by decree, parliament suspended, no elections, spreading fake news and rumors up to 5 years in prison, and leaving quarantine up to 8 years in prison. So the question then is the media reporting this accurately? Did Viktor Orban just make himself a dictator? Did he violate his country's constitution? Is he doing something that we wouldn't recognize as legal or lawful in the United States? Well, certainly there are pieces of this that certainly wouldn't pass muster in the United States. For example, this right here, spreading fake news and rumors leading to 5 years in prison. It would be very hard to see how that would pass First Amendment muster in the United States. But First Amendment is a feature of the United States Constitution. It's not necessarily the way that Hungary's constitution works. There is protections from freedom of speech, but they're suspendable. And we'll get into that in a second. But to answer the fundamental question of whether or not Orban is actually doing something extra constitutional, maybe we should just take a look at the Constitution of Hungary, or rather the fundamental law of Hungary adopted in April 2011. And in particular, focusing on the infrastructure, the sort of architecture of their emergency laws, because most countries in American states have some sort of existing constitutional or legislative framework when there is some sort of emergency and the executive needs to have additional powers. So in the Hungarian constitution, this is, again, the fundamental law of Hungary, we're focusing on the state of danger. So it says Article 53, Section 1, in the event of a natural disaster or industrial accident endangering life or property, or in order to mitigate its consequences, the government shall declare a state of danger and may induce extraordinary measures laid down in a cardinal act. Now, to be clear, this is a translation, so I'm not sure if this is precisely accurate, but it seems pretty close. And focusing in a state of danger, the government may adopt decrees by means of which it may, as provided for by a cardinal act, suspend the application of certain acts, that's like, as far as I can tell, statutes or pieces of legislation, derogate from the provisions of acts, and take other extraordinary measures. And then 3, and here's the important part, the decrees of the government referred to in paragraph 2 shall remain in force for 15 days unless the government, on the basis of authorization by the National Assembly, extends those decrees. And finally, of course, upon the termination of the state of danger, such decrees shall cease to have effect. Now, this is an interesting architecture for a national emergency. I mean, in America, we have something called the National Emergencies Act. You probably remember, if you've been paying close attention to the news, when the president tried to declare a national emergency in order to reallocate funding to the wall. You might also be aware that the president has declared a national emergency for the coronavirus and thus gaining access to some powers. And the exact nature of how it works varies from place to place, from country to country. But the basic idea is that, the legislatures realize that in times of emergency, you need to have an energetic executive. And the executive needs to be able to take actions in order to protect the public, and that needs to be done quickly rather than waiting for an entire legislature to get its act together. So that's similar. We're seeing something similar to that here. In Hungary's constitution, you have a basic architecture. This is one of the types of emergencies. If you go up, you see an unexpected attack, a terrorist threat, etc. So they have various different frameworks for different types of emergencies. The key one to focus on here, though, is this 15 days. Right? It says the decrees of the government referred to shall remain in force for 15 days unless the government, on the basis of authorization by the National Assembly, extends those decrees. So that's fairly sensible. What it's saying is that if the government can declare a state of emergency, but within 15 days it has to go to the parliament and get an extension. And if it doesn't do that, then the decrees are out. So that's essentially a forced sunset. Moving on. Now, another point is to understand that under the Constitution, in these emergency situations, Hungary's constitution allows for the suspension of certain fundamental rights. That's a little bit different than our constitution. Article 54, under a special legal order, which is this qualifies, like all these to go up and show you. All of these constitute special legal orders, as seen. Under a special legal order, the exercise of fundamental rights, with the exception of the fundamental rights provided for in Articles 2 and 3 and Article 28, may be suspended or restricted beyond the extent specified in Article 1.3. So it says, here is now that, changing location, this is where I think Hungary's individual rights protections are located, the freedom of responsibility. Article 1.3 says the rules for fundamental rights and obligations shall be laid down in an act. A fundamental right may only be restricted to allow the effective use of another fundamental right or to protect constitutional value to the extent absolutely necessary, proportionate to the objective pursued, and with full respect for the essential content of that right. So there's, getting rid of some of those limitations. They don't have to do the same thing if they're going to suspend your rights. But what they can't do is they can't suspend these. So they say human dignity shall be inviolable. Every human being shall have the right to life and human dignity. The life of the fetus shall be protected from the moment of conception. They've constitutionalized a prohibition on abortion, interestingly. Article 3 says no one should be subject to torture, so they can't just legalize torture. They can't allow medical or scientific experience on human beings, and they can't allow eugenics. And that's even in a state of emergency. You don't have to worry about that. But what they are allowed to do under their constitution, as it was enacted, is Article 6 says everyone shall have the right to have her private and family life respected. And Article 7, everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And it's not an explicit speech protection, but there's some, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion captures some of that. But, basically the way their constitution is structured, these can be briefly suspended in a time of emergency. That's the key thing to understand. So, and that's a constitutional mechanism within Hungary, as far as I can tell. So let's fast forward. So what exactly happened? What did Viktor Orban do? Well, according to Hungary Today, which is the sort of domestic paper, not our, frantic press, says that the special powers were granted to the government to fight the pandemic. Lawmakers on Monday passed a bill extending a state of emergency, granting the government special powers to contain the spread of the virus. Some new laws, flouting quarantine regulations, punishable by 3 years in prison, and anyone who disseminates fake news or distorted real information in a way that obstructs the effectiveness of the response to the pandemic is a crime punishable by 1 to 5 years in prison. So that probably wouldn't fly here, but it's clearly, under Hungary's constitution, it would likely pass constitutional muster there, at least. And let's take a look at one of the specific things that this does. So this is a Hungarian spectrum. I don't know if this is accurate, again, full disclosure, but it's a translation of the draft law that just passed in Hungary. So to kind of, basic preamble purpose type thing, in order to ensure the government can take the measures necessary to prevent and mitigate COVID-19. You see that there. And, just kind of scrolling down here. This law determines the special rules pertaining to the emergency decreed in Government Decree 40/2020, so one assumes that's the original emergency declaration, in order to prevent and mitigate the consequences of the human epidemic, jeopardizing life and property and causing mass infections, and to protect the health and life of Hungarian citizens. Okay, so that's sort of the announcement. And here you go. In such emergency, in order to guarantee for the Hungarian citizens the safety of life and health, personal safety, the safety of assets and legal certainty, etc., the government may suspend the enforcement of certain laws, depart from statutory regulations, and implement additional extraordinary measures by decree. Well, it's pretty similar to what you see in the existing constitution. Further, the government may exercise the competence granted in paragraph 1, I guess probably power or the authority is probably the right translation, to the extent necessary for the purpose of preventing, managing, and eliminating the human epidemic set forth in the decree. So that's a purpose section. What they're saying is you have the right to, basically they're giving Orban and his government, his executive branch, the right to, implement new laws, to make new orders by decree, as long as it's for the purpose of getting rid of the COVID virus. And then the second key operative section is this one. It says, pursuant to section 53.3 of the fundamental law, that's the Constitution, Parliament authorizes the government to extend the effect of sections 2 and 3 of the decree, and the government decree is set forth in section 53.1 and 53.2 of the fundamental law in the event of the emergency. I want to focus on this. Section 53.3, what is that? Go back here. Right? Article 53. 3. The decrees of the government referred to in paragraph 2 shall remain in force for 15 days. That's that 15-day time limit again. And what they're saying is we're going to let you do it as long as the emergency is declared. That's actually pretty normal. And, in the federal government, unless the parliament explicitly votes to overturn a national emergency declaration, it remains in force as long indefinitely, and the president gains access to specific emergency powers that he wouldn't otherwise have access to. That's not really that novel. And if anything, the point that 15-day period is a really short window. And so it's not surprising that Parliament would then extend it, and really extend it as long as it took, rather than wanting to have to sunset it over and over again. So back here, there's another key point. Part 2 here. The Parliament may withdraw the authorization set forth in paragraph 1 before the end of the emergency. So before the government declares the end of the emergency, Parliament can withdraw this authorization. So in that sense, it's, again, quite similar to our national emergency infrastructure. The president declares a national emergency. Congress, if they want to, can overturn that declaration. It's just very challenging. And here you have a similar deal where Parliament has been consulted more so than we do in the United States. They've been consulted about the declaration. They've now affirmed it through an act of Parliament, and they're still reserving the right to terminate the emergency and to terminate these rights that Orban has. This is really pretty straightforward. And if you think still, for some reason, this is just some massive authoritarian power grab, let's talk about what's happening in New York. I want to show you something, because Hungary has about 10 million people. It's about half the size of the state of New York, which I think is about 20 million people. So Hungary is a jurisdiction. It's about half the size of New York, and so roughly you could compare Orban's authority over a certain number of people to Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, right? Okay. What did the governor of New York do for this national emergency? This is his emergency declaration, declaring a disaster emergency. This was on March 7th. This was a few weeks ago. I, Andrew Cuomo, governor of the state of New York, find, pursuant to Section 28 of Article 2B of the Executive Law, that a disaster is impending in New York State for which the affected local governments are unable to respond adequately, and I do hereby declare a state disaster emergency. In addition, where is it? Here we go. This is the one I wanted to focus on. In addition, by virtue of the authority vested in me by Section 29A of Article 2B of the Executive Law, to temporarily suspend or modify any statute, local law, ordinance, order, or rule or regulation during a disaster emergency, if compliance with such statute, local law, ordinance, order, rule, or regulation would prevent, hinder, or delay action necessary to cope with a disaster emergency, or necessary to assist in aid in coping with such disaster, I hereby temporarily suspend or modify for the period from the date of this executive order through April 6th, 2020, the following. And he goes ahead and suspends, 6, 7, 8, 9 different laws that are in place unilaterally. How did he do that? How did Andrew Cuomo, when he declared this emergency, just unilaterally suspend the enforcement of certain laws? Sort of like what Orban now has the authority to do. Well, let's look at New York law. This is the Laws of New York, Consolidated Laws, Article 2B, State and Local Natural and Man-Made Disaster Preparedness. When the governor finds that a disaster has occurred, he shall declare a disaster emergency by executive order. They have to notify the public that the emergency exists. They have to include a description of the disaster. Here's the point. Here's another point. Such order or orders shall remain in effect for a period not to exceed 6 months or until rescinded by the governor, whichever occurs first. The governor may issue additional orders to extend the disaster emergency for additional periods not to exceed 6 months. So he's got unilateral authority to, one, declare an emergency, and then issue additional orders reinstating it. And he doesn't have to go to it doesn't look like he has to go to his Congress at all. Maybe there's some mechanism by which Congress can, or the New York legislator can overturn that, but it's not obvious what it is. So the next point, here's, getting ahead to where he actually is getting the authority to suspend these laws. Here's Section 29A. Subject to the state constitution, the federal constitution, and federal statutes and regulations, the government may by executive order temporarily suspend any statute, local law, ordinance, or orders, rules, or regulations, or parts thereof, of any agency during a state disaster emergency if compliance with such provisions would prevent, hinder, or delay action necessary to cope with the disaster. And he can issue directives during a state disaster emergency that is essentially rule by decree, rule by fiat. Here's the limits on that authority. No suspensions or directives shall be made for a period in excess of 30 days, provided that, upon reconsideration, the government can extend the suspension for additional periods not to exceed 30 days each. So he can keep unilaterally reenacting these every 30 days, these directives about what people have to do. No suspension or directive shall be made which is not in the interest of the health or welfare of the public, not reasonably necessary to aid the disaster effort. Well, that's partially what's in the Hungarian law as well. Hungarian law says that they're allowed to put in place these decrees for the purposes of stopping the pandemic. It can't be just unrelated to that. Any such suspension shall specify the statute, local law to be suspended and the terms or conditions of the suspension. I'm not sure there's something like that under Hungarian law, but maybe there is under their emergency statute. And there's some restrictions on this. And again, there's essentially there's a legislative veto, effectively. The legislature may terminate by concurrent resolution, so both houses of the New York legislature can terminate these executive orders, but until they do that, he can rule by decree. So, I mean, there's an immense amount of power. What I'm saying, I want to focus on the point. There's an immense amount of power that the government has in a circumstance like this. There's an immense amount of power that Andrew Cuomo has in this situation. And so when our news media reports that Viktor Orban has become a dictator because he's extended his own emergency authority beyond 15 days, and not realizing that emergency authority is already being exercised by governments all around the world. It's already being exercised by our president. It's already being exercised by Andrew Cuomo. And that emergency authority here includes most of the things that Orban would have the authority to do. Like, this emergency authority gives Cuomo the authority to issue directives and to suspend the enforcement of any laws he thinks are a bad idea. I mean, that's the authority that Orban has as well. Now, let's go to, this is Balázs Orban. So this is the deputy prime minister of Hungary. And he's trying to explain, why he needs to enact a national emergency. It just sounds a lot like why we would implement a national emergency. One of the 6 special legal statutes in the fundamental law, their constitution, the government may declare an emergency for 15 days in the event of an elemental or industrial disaster that endangers the safety of life and property to address its consequences. This is clearly designed to deal with circumstances like the present. They restrict fundamental rights more than they do in peacetime. That's right. In a time of peace, a democratic state cannot impose a curfew, restrict, or even temporarily include certain economic sectors and say, that's true here. You can't just curfew people randomly for no reason in the United States. But, all that this is happening is it's giving the authority to the Prime Minister of Hungary, the same kind of authority over Hungary that Andrew Cuomo is exercising over the state of New York, which is to quarantine and do things that suspend the application of laws and implement directives to protect the public health, whether or not there's an existing law passed by Parliament. This is classic emergency action. It's classic emergency law. And the idea that the entire left-wing press would be getting up and saying, Viktor Orban's now acting like a dictator, when we had 40 ongoing national emergencies on the books. Andrew Cuomo is doing very similar stuff in New York. This is a very, very routine and mundane exercise of emergency authority, as far as I can read it. And the sort of fear-mongering, really, this is a kind of ridiculous fear-mongering and panic-mongering around this. It's just unfair to Prime Minister Orban, unfair to Hungary, and really, really, I think, discriminatory. The kind of thing that these people would not write about Andrew Cuomo, they certainly are willing to write about Viktor Orban because he's a conservative, and they can get away with it too because there's no Hungarian press that's really available to the United States, so they're essentially able to just libel and slander these guys recklessly. It's a ridiculous claim. Viktor Orban's not a dictator. He's just getting a normal emergency authority, and the entire mainstream media needs to quiet and sit down. Anyway, if you enjoyed this is my very first video on YouTube. I do a lot of live streaming on Periscope. You can follow me there. But follow me on Twitter @WillChamberlain and follow this channel. Subscribe to this channel. If you enjoyed this content, let me know, and we'll see if we can't do some more interesting things. Thanks so much.